Jacques Vallée, it's great to see you and great to be able to talk to you as always. I want to start with the broader discussion about UFO crashes. As noted in the book, the Trinity, the best kept secret, you get asked, as I do a lot,
Yes.
about UFO crashes. How is it possible they crash? They fly all the way here from Zeta Reticuli, and then they get here and they crash. I don't buy it. That's what people tell me. How do you answer people when they ask that question?
Well, it's a fair question, and I must eat humble pie here because for a long time people have been after me, to talk about crashes, and I haven't talked about it very much. And I remember the days with Dr. Hynek where, we were talking about Roswell and all the other cases, and people were sending us data, about things that they had picked up, but we never had something, that we could take to the lab, and test, and until really this case. Even at Roswell, as fascinating as Roswell is, and of course I believe the witnesses, but the witnesses got to the site a couple of days later. Okay, there wasn't anyone there who actually saw the thing crash on that particular property. They had to search for it, if you remember, and there was this big, storm, and they had trouble finding the location. In fact, still now there are people arguing that there are two different locations, and so on. In this case, this is a turning point because the case happened on the property where the witnesses were. They were there every day. There were two young children, when the oldest one was 9, but they were there every day checking the cattle for their family. This was at the end of World War II when all the adults were fighting. All the able-bodied men and women were deployed from Japan to, Germany. And so the children were given the job of taking care of the cattle. And on that particular day, they were looking for a cow that they knew was going to have a calf. And their father wanted to make sure that the calf was okay, that the mother was okay, and they could mark the calf with their brand and everything else. So they were there, and they were there with very good binoculars on their horse, and an object came up. It came in from the east, from the southeast, and it hit a communication tower, which was controlling communication on the north end of White Sands. Those were the late days of World War II. The atom bomb had been exploded there about over 3 weeks before. They had seen the explosion. They were within the perimeter, the enlarged perimeter of White Sands. So they were well used to the military operations in the area. That communication tower was both for civilian and military airplanes, guiding them around the mountain. After it crashed into the tower, the object got to the ground. It didn't exactly crash. It kept its integrity. It didn't blow up into pieces the way an airplane would have. It was apparently very strong. The tower was bent, but the object kept going. It came to the ground, and it plowed an avenue all the way down the hill. They made a turn, apparently under power, and stopped against a bump in the terrain. The kids saw that. Now, remember, this was 1945, August 1945, 2 years before Roswell. There was no concept of flying saucers. Kenneth Arnold would come up with that term in July, August 47 is when all that thing about flying saucers came up. So there was no concept of something like that. And also, the object wasn't a saucer. The object was shaped like an egg, like an avocado. You know, they of course spoke Spanish, and the term they used was an avocado, about the size of 2 trucks. So this was, it's hard to say that it didn't happen. I mean, obviously it did happen. I mean, the tower was bent. There were the traces on the ground. The kids knew that the first thing to do in a case like this, again, was the end of the war, was to help the pilots of whatever that thing was. So they rushed down. The vegetation is on fire. The brush is on fire. The object is not on fire, contrary to what some books have said. But we have all the details because with, Paola Harris was the first to know about the case. She interviewed both of the witnesses, who by then were in their 70s. And I've had a chance with her over the last 4 years to re-interview Mr. Padilla, Jose Padilla, who is still very much alive, has an extremely good memory, which I envy. I don't have a good memory. And he, we've reconstructed everything. And we found a 3rd witness, and we found a 4th witness. There was a bomber that was coming in for a landing at Alamogordo. Alamogordo is the air base inside White Sands, which is an enormous area, as you know. And he was told by the control tower to take a look at the communication tower because they had lost communication with the north end of the range. So he circles the tower. He says the tower has been hit by something. So he confirms what the witnesses are telling us. And then he sees the fire and the smoke. So he circles the object. He describes that there is an object there and 2 little Indians. Well, they are not Indians, but they are there with their horses. So we have a check from everything. And the 2 kids look at the object. They are shocked to see there is an opening. Apparently, there is 1 panel that has been ejected when the thing hit the tower. Through that opening, they see 3 beings, 3 creatures inside. And I've had a chance to go through the transcripts that Paola recorded. Sometimes they talk about little men. Sometimes they talk about creatures. So I asked Jose, how come you can't tell if they are creatures or men? Well, they were short. They were about the same size as the kids, about 4 feet tall. They were humanoid. They were breathing the air. They didn't have, a helmet or a mask or anything else. They had sharp eyes. They had almost no mouth and very little nose. And they were wearing coveralls that looked gray. And they stayed inside the object. So the kids saw them through that opening, sort of being apparently very agitated, very worried but they were apparently not hurt. So they watched this for a while, and then they say they have to report it to somebody. The older kid, Jose, wants to go inside and help. The younger kid, Remy, doesn't want anything to do with it. He's very scared. He's crying. He's terrified. They decide the important thing is to report it, which is true. They get on their horses. They go home. They report it to their father, and the father calls the state police, and the state police is going to come there, 48 hours later with the father and with the kids. So that's essentially the stage. Paola was the first to know about the case. and to interview both of the witnesses and to gather the information. And then she brought me in to look at the technical aspects of it. And we've been working on it for 4 years. I've gone there 5 times.
So Jacques, you co-wrote the book with Paulo Harris, a well-known UFO investigator. How is it the two of you came together and decided to work on this and dig deeper?
Well, about a year before, I had started to look at other cases in New Mexico where there was an opportunity to, we thought, to recover some hardware, or at least some samples. As you know, there are a half a dozen crash sites in New Mexico. Through colleagues of mine and the scientists at Stanford, we had access to a site that had been kept very quiet, very secret. And we were going there with metal detectors and shovels to dig up something. And in fact, we found a number of things that we were bringing back to the lab to test it. I had a friend who was very interested in this, who lived in New Mexico, and who told me there is another case that you should look at. And he invited me to look into, this case in San Antonio, New Mexico. I didn't know much about the case. He didn't tell me much. He told me that that was a case that was linked to the end of World War II and to the atom bomb. And he took me to the Owl Cafe, which is now a very notorious place near San Antonio. That's San Antonio, New Mexico, not right. San Antonio, Texas. And I had a good time there, absorbing the atmosphere. Of course, that was a place where the scientists from Project Manhattan came to have dinner. And so that little place in the middle of nowhere was serving hamburgers and, selling produce and so on to the scientists when they were in the middle of the preparation for the bomb. Nobody knew, of course, who they were, but they were, Enrico Fermi, Oppenheimer, Nobel Prizes, people from all over the place, from all over Europe and America, working on finishing and testing the bomb. So that was a very, impressive and humbling experience. I became aware that Paula had already researched the case and had put some of her interviews on record. So that's when I decided to call her, and then we got together. The idea was that I had access to analysis, I had access to scientists who could help me look at any data we could get. So that would, augment the research she had done, interviewing the witnesses at the site. So she introduced me to Mr. Padilla, and Mr. Padilla took us to the site several times and explained the situation.
There are a lot of alleged crash sites. You mentioned there are 6 in New Mexico. There are others all over the world. And the stories, the reports dug up by different investigators have varying degrees of credibility. Is that part of why you stayed away from the subject, at least in public? Because, for example, Roswell, the granddaddy of them all, for me, even though as much time as I spend on this, it becomes sort of muddled with all the disinformation from government people and then bad information from UFO folks. It's a slog to get through this stuff.
Yes. Well, my reference for Roswell was always Stanton Friedman's books, because Stanton was, an atomic physicist, and he was very good at tracking down stories into the archives, of official archives. But you're right. I mean, it's still, when you talk to scientists about that, they say, fascinating story. I'm ready to believe you. I know your reputation. You're not crazy, but you haven't given me anything I can take back to the lab and test. Okay. This case helps the credibility of Roswell, because we found details about the material that has been recovered there, including some material from inside the object, from inside the craft, that we can test, and we're doing that now. So it's very, and by the way, we're going to go into that at the conference that Paula is organizing November 11, 12, 13 in Laughlin, in Nevada, and I'll be there, and we're going to talk about the details of all of that. The important thing with that case also is that the kids were there for the following 10 days. It was their land, and we know everything that the army did. I mean, the army was not prepared to recover something like this. Once they realized that it was real, it wasn't their property. It wasn't public property, it belonged to the father of Mr. Padilla. So they went to the house and they asked, and again, in researching this, I rediscovered a part of history, of American history. I mean, forget the UFO. I mean, we can talk about that separately, but the historical data about the end of the war, about Japan, about the capitulation of Japan, about what would have happened if we hadn't had the atom bomb, about the testing of the atom bomb, which was not a test, it was a full-scale atom bomb. It was equal to in power to the one that destroyed Nagasaki in Japan, after Hiroshima. I didn't realize all of that. I didn't realize the science, all the details of the science that had gone into this, how the testing was done. I had to learn all that. And fortunately, now it's over 50 years after the A-bomb, and a number of very good historical books have come out. So I bought all those books and I read them cover to cover. And that sort of brought me up to date. The kids had seen the explosion of the atom bomb. Jose's mother had been blinded in one eye by the explosion because she heard the sound, and she looked over the horizon and she saw this, and the power of the light blinded her in one eye. So this is real. I mean, the army people who came to talk to the father of Senor Padilla was speaking Spanish. I mean, the officers, the army officers who were there in New Mexico, of course they were bilingual, and the conversations were in Spanish. And part of the population was Indian, was American Indian. So we've reconstructed all of this, and all the books about Trinity, they talk about Professor Oppenheimer, they talk about Dr. Enrico Fermi, they talk about the physics. They forget everybody. Well, the physicists were there for 4 years, and then they went back to the University of Chicago or wherever, teaching atomic physics after that. The people who were there, they stayed there, and the population had been exposed to a lot of radioactivity, the same amount of radioactivity that was exposed at Nagasaki. And nobody knows that. Nobody talks about that. Everybody says there was a test. Well, a test in science is, you take a little vial and you mix a couple of liquids, and then you take a spectrum or a photograph, and that's a test. And if it works, you get a patent. And so this was not a test. This was an explosion at ground level, which is the worst thing they could have done. And after the Project Manhattan, at White Sands, they reset the explosion of the bomb in altitude to minimize the radioactivity in Japan. So the Japanese, I don't think the Japanese are going to send flowers, to the U.S. Army because of that, but they wanted to minimize the radioactivity on the ground. That's not what the bomb was supposed to. I mean, that wasn't the main military use of the bomb. The bomb was, it was the heat and the explosion. It wasn't the radioactivity. And at that test, 20 miles from that property, 20 miles from that land, is where they realized the mistake of blowing the bomb on the ground. Also, the bomb was 4 times more powerful than the calculations they had done. Okay. So, learning that to me was for a scientist like me, it was like a dream, to be able to get that information, much of which comes from the army brochures. It's not in any books, it's in the, but now it's in our book, in the Trinity book. So we learned a lot as a result of that, and we were humbled by the experience. The army had to make a break in the fence, so they had to ask permission to do that, to open the fence. Mr. Padilla said, well, there is an opening for the cattle, why don't you use that? They said, no, we need a bigger opening, we need a bigger truck. So I had a little fight with Paola because I wanted to know what kind of truck it was. And she said, why do you need to know that? I mean, that's not the story. The story is of little kids, what they saw, the aliens, I mean, the craft. I said, yeah, but, I need to know the weight of the craft. And the truck is going to tell me, how much the craft weighed. The kids tried to move it. Remember, they were there even when the soldiers went for lunch or dinner. The kids were there on the property. They knew how to ride. They would leave their horses in the back. They were fascinated day after day after day. And in the book, there's a table, of what happened every day on that property. And so the human story is extraordinary. And the physics story is extraordinary because on the last day, there was nobody watching the object. The object was on the truck. By the way, the truck was an 18-wheeler. So the thing was not a weather balloon. The army officer who came in to talk to the father said, we need to recover our weather balloon. And he said, oh, I've got weather balloons for you because the property is 80,000 acres. And, White Sands was launching weather balloons every day to know the direction of the wind and so on for the aircraft. By the way, there was no Air Force at the time. Right. They were pilots, but they were attached to the Army. It was the Army Air Force. We're 2 years away from, the President Truman declaring, an independent Air Force for America. So he had weather balloons that he was picking up that he was keeping to return them to the Army. And so he brought them an armful of weather balloons, and they said, no, it's a special weather balloon. Well, my estimation is between 4.5 tons and 5 tons. Again, the kids tried to move it when it was on the truck, ready to go. It was on the side, because if it had been upright, it wouldn't have gone under the overpass on the highway, the Trans-America Highway that goes through San Antonio. And so they could see the underside. And in the underside, there was no opening. And there were no propellers. There were no jets. There was no opening. What makes it work? I mean, what's the propulsion system? So that case is a treasure for us, back in California, in Silicon Valley. It's a treasure of information. We know the weight, we know the dimensions. The kids measured it. They were clever kids, and you grew up quickly in those days. Now I'm almost as old as Mr. Padilla. He's 85. I'm 82. I was born in 1939 in occupied France. I remember the end of the war. I remember, my parents' house being destroyed by a bomb. I remember watching, the Germans shooting down American planes. I mean, there was no place to hide. I saw that, okay? So in those days, I was 5 by the 5.5 by the end of the war in Europe. War in Japan wasn't finished. Okay, so you have to go back to those days to really understand what went on. Kids were growing up quickly then. I mean, this was serious. This was serious for them. This was not a joke. And their memory, this was seared into their memory. And we were able to check it very well because one of their cousins was younger and she came to that land, several years later when, so by then the two young men had grown up and gone on, but she was there with the father and the father was still picking up objects, that on the property that had strange physical properties that are very similar to what was recovered 2 years later at Roswell. So we have a continuity now, and it gives us a point of, the starting point for the UFO crashes and landings in the United States. It didn't start in 47. It started in New Mexico on the land of Project Manhattan in August 1945.
The witnesses, the kids who walk up to this craft, it digs a big trench and it's got in the land, and then there's a hole in it. They see 3 creatures inside that are alive. They had an emotional response that was seemingly generated, right?
They again, I had the benefit of the transcripts that Paula had recorded. I've learned in my work with computers, with the internet and so on, at analyzing transcripts and terms that people use and so on, because we built one of the very early social networks on the internet. My team did that. So we analyzed the behavior of people using a computer conferencing system for the first time. And the terms they use, again, are very interesting. Obviously, they were there to try to help, quote, the pilots. They realized that there are no pilots. There are these creatures. The creatures don't look at them, but their mind fills up with images that seem to come from. So there is a form of communication that they've never experienced before. And they are going to have dreams, recurrent dreams for several years after that. And Mr. Padilla told me that for about 3 years, he would wake up in sweat in the middle of the night, going back to that time and seeing things falling from the sky and seeing, people dying and all of that, a feeling of tragedy, and then he would wake up. Okay. Those images stay with them, and that's why the little one is crying, doesn't want to go anywhere close. Jose Padilla told us, I wanted to go there, but if I had gone there, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wouldn't be giving this interview now. And that was very powerful. And as you know very well, George, that's something that you hear in many cases of that form of sort of, for lack of a better word, telepathic or psychic communication with the people who are close to these objects.
I think we got time for one more question before we have to shut down here. So yeah, they had an emotional response, not only of their own reaction to the scene, but seemingly they had a mind meld with these beings. Are there similar cases around the world where that has happened before?
So in the book, and again, before we go, the book is called Trinity, the best kept secret. It's the best kept secret because the kids were too impressed to talk about it for over 50 years. And for other reasons we could go into, this was never reported to the Air Force. So this is not in Blue Book. Dr. Hynek never knew about this case. It went to the atomic secrets, which are kept separate from all the other secrets in the United States. It's never come out. Okay. So we would never know about it if Paula had not done that interview. Now, in the book, we talk about 2 other cases, the one in Socorro that you know well and I know well because I studied it with Dr. Hynek at Northwestern at the time. And a case in France at Valençol that had also that type of communication. But the witness there was a former soldier of the resistance in France. You know, he was in his 40s by then. This is a case in 1968, July 1st, 1968, when, you know, he was faced again with an oval object. In Socorro, it's not a flying saucer, it's an avocado. In Valençol in France, you know, in the Alps, at the foot of the Alps in France, it's also, you know, an egg-shaped object, all three. And there's a figure in the book comparing them and comparing the dimensions. So those are not flying saucers. And in all three cases, there is that psychic impulse that the witnesses don't quite know how to deal with.
We're talking with Jacques Vallée about a book he co-wrote with Paula Harris, Trinity, the best kept secret. Jacques, in 1945, the Trinity bomb goes off. The world is changed forever. A month later, something comes looking at that site. Something shows up at that site looking around. Does it make sense to you that a non-human intelligence, wherever it's from, would be interested in what was going on in New Mexico back then, given that so many different sites in that state were doing atomic projects and testing missiles and things of that sort? And intelligence, even human intelligence, would be interested in, but a non-human intelligence, wherever it's from, would want to check this out. This test, in effect, could have been like a beacon announcing to the universe that we've arrived in the atomic age.
This was a turning point in human history. You know, in 10,000, 100,000 years of human development, of civilization development, there had never been anything like it. There had been wars, there had been things like that, but never something of that power that could be seen from outer space, could be detected. Is that the reason why that object showed up? The fact is that ever since we have not used an atomic bomb in war. It was very tempting to, you know, terminate the war in Korea with a bomb. It must have been very tempting to use, you know, other types of nuclear weapons in war. Came very, very close to that at Cuba, you know, during the Cuban crisis. In another story that hasn't been told very much, where it came within minutes of a nuclear exchange in Cuba. So the reason is that because there was that form of communication. I mean, this was something that the American army could not miss. I mean, they had, the thing was deposited there. There was no explanation for, and believe me, we've tried to think of every way this could be a hoax. You know, but you don't hoax, you know, a flying avocado weighing 5 tons that's going to hit a communication tower, take it out of communication, and then land under power and essentially create an avenue the size of a football field under power, you know. And I mean, what kind of hoax is that? I mean, if you could do that, think of all the other things you could do rather than joking about it. Again, we have 2 witnesses who were smart, who had binoculars to follow everything that was going on. They knew how to use it. Those were professional binoculars. Why did the kids have binoculars? Well, you know, people say, well, you know, kids are playing with binoculars. They were not playing with binoculars. That the property is 80,000 acres and you have cattle there. They needed to read the brands on the cattle from a distance. So those were as good as the army binoculars, and they knew how to use them, and they were passing the binoculars back and forth to check on what they were seeing. Those were excellent observers. Mr. Padilla went on to be a highway patrolman after being at war in Korea. He has 2 bullets in his body, one from the war and one from someone that he was arresting, as a cop in California, as a highway patrol officer. These are serious people. This is not a joke. The reason, so I asked him, again, to me, it was just an extraordinary experience to work, to have the opportunity to work with Paola in this case, and to meet the witnesses, Mr. Padilla and Sabrina Padilla, who came in later, gave us the other information. I asked Mr. Padilla, why was it so important for you to go in and get something? Because he went into the object on the last day. The beings were gone. We don't know where they went, if they were taken by the army or if they were recovered by their own kind or whatever. There is a gap of 24 hours where we don't know what happened. And they found a bracket. Jose was alone inside, described the inside to me very precisely. There was a panel on the wall of the object. We don't know what else had been there because the army had cleaned up everything, of course, that they could find. But this was, attached to the wall of the object, and there was a bracket that could turn, and he managed to get it, to rip it out, and went away with it. And we have it. He donated it to us, and we're going to be donating it to a university for further study. Well, I said, why was that so important? And he said, well, in those days, everybody wanted to have a souvenir. Now, up to then, we've spoken occasionally Spanish and most of the time English. Souvenir is a French word. And that struck me, why do you call that a souvenir? He said, well, so many people died in the war. They were not coming back, brothers, uncles, fathers. And it was very important for a family. In many cases, they couldn't get the body. It was very important for the family to have something to remember them by. And that's what we call a souvenir. So, that's how that French word sort of came into the language in New Mexico in 1945, where nobody spoke French. And so those are the little things that are important, should be important to a historian.
They called it a treasure too, right? A Spanish word for
treasure? Yes, tesoro.
Yeah.
They call it the tesoro, the treasure.
And it's a cool story in the book, Trinity, about how they held on to that. They put it to use for all these years. They had a use for that piece that they took out of a crashed vehicle.
Yes, well, they were hiding it. What's interesting, well, so we're fighting with my colleagues about whether this thing is important or not. It's a bracket, and similar to many brackets you can buy, for as part of a well. In fact, I bought one. This is kind of heavy. It's usually in an alloy of aluminum or something else. This one I got from a shop. So they turn around an axis, and they activate. There are actuators here that are attached to different parts of a well or a particular machine. So those things have been around since the 30s or the 40s, 1930s, 1940s. And so it's not very unusual. The question is, what was it doing there? So my theory is, well, the army brought it, to wind up something, maybe a wire to work at night or whatever. There is no electricity there, but the Jeeps, I used to have a Jeep, to do my own UFO investigations, and the Jeep can generate power. I mean, it was bringing power to the battlefield and so on. So that could have come from that. They could have needed power inside the object to clean it up or whatever they did inside at night. My friends disagree because there are some very, very unusual aspects to that bracket. You can buy a bracket almost like it, at some hardware store, but this is a little bit different. So we're still investigating that and arguing about that. So there is research being done on that instrument.
The kids picked up some pieces of what it's sort of like memory foil similar to Roswell. They picked up that. They put some of it to work in a windmill, right? They stashed it away and then they had it on the windmill.
Yes, they found a strip of memory metal, and at one time there was the father. It was a water mill for a well, and the father told them to try to fix some parts that were not working, and they couldn't fix it, and the shop couldn't fix it, and they thought of this memory metal. They wrapped it up around the axle and put the thing back together, and it worked for many years. So yes, there was a. Unfortunately, we don't have it now, but if you remember, I mean, that shows up also at Roswell, and we could trace it to some. There were a few places in the U.S. that were looking for that kind of material. Battelle Memorial Institute has been very involved in the UFO study on the dark side, and they developed a type of memory metal that's much like that. The question is, would it have been in existence at Roswell, 1947, maybe 1945? Well, that's really pushing it. Did we have that kind of technology, or is it alien technology? We don't know. We don't know that. So we're continuing to look into that with in the lab now, in a real lab.
The Army came looking for scraps and pieces and asking people, "Hey, did you find any?" They wanted it back, right?
They wanted it back, and that's what makes us think that it's not just another bracket, that you can get at a hardware store in New Mexico somewhere. The dimensions, there are holes, and this is not the real one, but in the real one there are holes like this for an axle and so on. The dimensions are in centimeters. They are in the metric system. The U.S. Army was not using the metric system in any parts that they had in 1945. So it wasn't an Army part. Now, it could have come from Mexico. Mexico, I believe, uses the metric system based on the French, trades and so on. But that's very curious. So, we're not at the end of that. We're at the beginning of that study. And the book, again, Trinity, is just talking about the beginning of it. We have a lot of work to do still.
You went to the site multiple times. You
Yes.
looked for bits and pieces. Did you find bits and pieces somewhere in the ground?
No, but we heard many, accounts for another thing that they found was a sort of angel hair. They call it angel hair or light fiber. Well, it's not a light fiber like we use now in communication. Remember the book by Colonel Corso?
Sure.
Colonel Corso describes some of the same things. So we know, again, the kids are not lying. But Corso talks about that stuff from Roswell and other places 2 years later. Now we have references to that in 1945. That's important. The kids used it for to decorate Christmas trees because it glowed in the dark. Well, you know, the fiber today, you know, an electronic fiber doesn't glow in the dark. You know, you put a little bit of light at one end, it comes out at the other at the speed of light, or some fraction of the speed of light. So it's great for the computer. But if you look at the fiber, you're not going to see the fiber glowing. So, and also it wasn't a fiber, a straight fiber, it was a bundle, like a spider web of fibers that were glowing. There were other things that were glowing like that and may have been irradiated. So, but if they were irradiated, why would they still glow, you know, 5 years later? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So again, where in terms of physics, it's extremely interesting.
There's a where the craft came to rest, there was a noticeable indentation there in the ground that you could see for a long time. And yes, as you note in the book, Trinity, somebody came in and planted a bunch of these plants that are poisonous.
They are poisonous, and they are poisonous to cattle. So why would you? I could understand wanting to keep people away from it. I mean, people who've gone there. There are some people from UFO who were brought there to help investigation. They came back with rashes, you know, and Jose Padilla still has a rash on his arm, you know, that's sort of permanent, like a scar. So those plants were very poisonous. They are not used anywhere else. I mean, they are not native to New Mexico. Why would you go to the trouble to put a plant like that where it could actually harm the cattle? And we don't know why that was there. It's not there now, but they've also brought dirt on top of that. So now anything that would have been at the surface then is under 15 feet of dirt now. And I don't think the state of New Mexico is going to let you bring a bulldozer and level that up, because it's at a place where if it washes off, it's going to take a lot of debris over the highway, you know, which is, you know, transcontinental highway. So there are a number of earth dams, you know, all over the place to stop the, you know, the water when it pours. If you've ever been in a downpour in New Mexico, you know that can be pretty bad.
A lot of interest in metamaterials, pieces picked up from alleged crash sites. You know, there's always been interest in that, but it's heightened right now. You've been involved very quietly in this work for a long time and testing samples. Can you give me your general sense of how promising that is? And does a piece have to be unobtainium to be important? Does it have to be element 115 or some undiscovered element in order to be important and suggest that it's not ours, that somebody else made it or used it?
Well, element 115 has been discovered.
Yes.
The problem is that it only exists for 1/1,000,000th of a second, you know, right. So that's, I don't think you can buy a bucket of it. But I've had that discussion again with scientists who know more about materials than I do. It's a very complex area. The fight I have with them is, look, the most advanced car in the world is the Toyota hydrogen car, which I can buy, you know, down the road here in San Francisco. And I've looked at it. When it was demonstrated by the president of Toyota on the stage, the car was there and the car was running. And the president of Toyota explained, you know, the technology that went into the car and why this was eliminated the need for, you know, all these poisonous batteries that we talk about the battery as being good for the environment. Well, the car is clean, but the battery isn't. The battery has lead and cadmium and things that, you know, will kill natural things. So it's terrible. Hydrogen is very clean. I mean, hydrogen is the most abundant element in the cosmos. It's pretty hard to extract it from water, but, you know, we know how to do it. So we could start an industry that would do that. This would be great for the oil companies because, you know, they reject hydrogen. They can't sell it to anybody. So this would be, you could build a huge industry around hydrogen. So the president of Toyota explains all that, and then he turns to the car. He's got a glass under the tailpipe where water has been dripping, because the only exhaust from a hydrogen car is pure water. It recombines hydrogen with oxygen to power the car. And the result is water. So the water drops out of the tailpipe. He takes the glass and drinks it. Mm-hmm. Now, that you've been in television for a long time, you know, that's an effective demonstration, you know. Now, why, your question is absolutely right. I mean, why do we assume that, you know, a craft from somewhere else would have very, very esoteric, you know, components? Maybe they just use hydrogen, you know. Whatever they use, it doesn't have an exhaust, because again, the kids, so the object at, you know, was about 14 feet tall, 14, 15 feet high. And there was a floor. So I asked Jose when he was inside, what kind of floor was it? Well, the floor was flat. Okay. So they went to the trouble of having a flat floor in this ovoid, you know, avocado-sized object. From the calculation, there would be about 2.5 feet under the floor, over maybe 7 or 8 feet, where you could put an engine. There is no opening. Okay, there were some bumps under the thing. It wasn't damaged, by the way, so it must have been extremely hard, because again, it plowed an avenue all the way down the hill. It wasn't broken. There was no break. It was, you know, there were some friction traces, but it wasn't open. We don't know what was inside. I mean, if there is a propulsion system, it's got to be inside. How do you do that? So again, the craft was taken over. It would have been taken over by Project Manhattan. That's the Atomic Energy Commission. And we have one more proof of where it went. Remy Baca, who was a little kid, grew up and went to Washington. He became involved in politics, and he was instrumental in getting the governor of the state of Washington elected. And one time when he was with her, she showed him the report from the Atomic Energy Commission about the object. She didn't let him keep it or read it, but she showed him the official report. Now, in the secret system of the United States, a system of classified documents, you know, you've investigated, you know, I've been exposed to it. There is the main system, which goes through the Pentagon, you know, confidential, secret, top secret, and then various flavors of secrecy on top of that, or aside from that. Then there is the foreign intelligence secrets that go through the State Department, you know, primarily, mainly the diplomatic secrets, okay? Not the CIA secrets, but the diplomatic would go to the State Department. And then from there, on request, on need, they would be supplied to the White House or to Congress and so on a need-to-know basis. But then there is a third level, a third type of classification, which is the RP and Q clearances that are what you need to work, if you're a physicist, to work at Livermore, at Lawrence Livermore, or at Los Alamos, and so on. Those are the atomic secrets. There is no reason why people at the CIA should have those secrets unless they work on atomic, you know, on nuclear secrets. So that's why this is not in the Air Force files. This is not in the CIA files. This is not in anybody's files. It never came out. It came out because we have the witnesses and we can talk about it freely. but we would never get, unless you're really inside the atomic secrets, you would never have permission to have access to that level of classification. You wouldn't know about it. The president wouldn't need to be told about it unless there was something that came up specifically on that topic, where today it would be the Secretary of Energy who would have authority. Used to be an Atomic Energy Commission, and it changed names over the years, but that's where it would be. And we also know from testimony from the man in charge of the government project in Canada, who was given a piece of something that had been shot by one of our pilots, a Navy pilot, over Washington in 1952. He had been, the Canadian guy had been given a piece of that. And the American officer who gave it to him told him that this was classified higher than the atom bomb in the United States. Okay, so we know all that. I mean, this is not something where there is controversy. I mean, it's on record.
Why do you suppose this thing crashed? And are there other explanations that make sense for the other alleged crashes? For example, lightning, powerful radar, or are some of these crashes not crashes at all? Could it be that they're made to look like a crash, so we've got a new toy to play with?
I think somebody is trying to get our attention, and evidently in this particular case at Trinity, they got our attention, and I think that may be why there has been so much caution about using, nuclear explosions, nuclear bombs in war, in anger, because that mystery has never been resolved.
It makes sense why a non-human intelligence would be interested in an atomic bomb going off, even somebody from outer space, some other system. You don't necessarily believe that these visitors are from other planets. They could be, but is it possible that they live here, that they're concerned about the planet because in a sense they live here?
Well, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, it was, I think it was legitimate to assume that if something like that was seen, that it would be a spacecraft. Okay, because we were starting to build spacecraft. We had rockets. We're still firing rockets, bigger and better. We don't have that technology, but we could assume that an advanced race somewhere could have something like that. If you talk to a physicist today, not the ufologist physicist, but just a straight down the line physics professor, he'll say that's not the only hypothesis you should look at, because now we know there could be parallel universes. There could be other forms of energy we haven't discovered. And by the way, when I teach my class in physics, I teach quantum mechanics on Monday, and I teach general relativity on Tuesday. And there are a few bright kids who say, sir, how come they don't match? Okay, you just said that that there were an infinity of dimensions, and then you talk about Einstein, and he doesn't say that. Okay, so come on. I mean, how do we resolve that? Well, somebody may have resolved that little problem, which we've never resolved since the days of Einstein. And so if you take that seriously, and physicists take that seriously, there could be, like Dr. Hynek used to say, in his lectures, there could be another Earth 5 minutes ahead of us. And there could be ways to come from one to the other, or to communicate from one to the other.
People will argue a secret like this cannot be kept. Something crashed at San Antonio, New Mexico. There were a lot of people who saw it. It can't possibly be kept. The other crashes, Roswell, of course, a lot of things have leaked out about these cases over the years, but secrets can be kept. You worked in secrecy on this project because you didn't want ufologists to kind of poison the well before you got to write the book, right?
Yeah, but we knew that we were going to disclose it but we wanted to disclose the whole story. We didn't want to give people bits and pieces of things, because even now, people come and they've read something about it and they say, well, they were kids, kids lie all the time. Not those kids, not in 1945, not when you're 20 miles away from the first nuclear explosion on Earth, and not when you have a father like, Mr. Padilla. You don't joke about that. You go to that little diner, well, I'd love to go there with you and, get a hot dog over there. It's full of the posters from that, loose lips kill, those posters, those yellow posters, very emotional. You talk about something you've seen, you could get killed. You could get other people killed, and the kids grew up in that atmosphere. They grew up with that, and so they didn't talk when Roswell was all over TV, and they didn't talk. After all that, they didn't talk to Hynek. They didn't talk to anybody, because this was something that was too profound for them. And also inside, that's very clear when you speak even today with Jose, with Mr. Padilla, that it's still something that has changed his life, that he remembers very clearly. There is this argument among psychologists, what do kids remember? And the fact is that all of us, sort of make up details, or we don't exactly remember how things were. There were a few things when I was, 3, 4, 5. I don't remember anything before I was about 2. But after that, I remember the end of World War II. I remember what I saw. I was very fortunate that my father had been an officer in World War I. He knew when there was danger. Usually there was danger because things were flying from the sky, but he knew we couldn't hide anywhere. And there was never a sense of fear, in my parents. So I wasn't exposed to that kind of fear of the war. The things I saw at a distance. I wasn't there when the house was blown up. We must have been in a shelter somewhere. We did have shelters. There was no house when we came out. I remember that. There are things like that, yeah, you may have been 3 at the time, but they come back exactly as they happened. Now, I couldn't tell you what I did afterwards. It's not a normal memory, that extends with a before and after. This is just, 3, frames of a film.
So much interesting research going on right now. We're learning so much more. A week ago today, some of your former colleagues or current colleagues, Colin Kelleher, Jim Lakatsky, and I put out a book about OSAP. I don't believe that you've ever made any public comments about OSAP. Separate from ATIP, that was something different. But is there anything you want to say about the work you did? They praised the computer database that you created, but
well, that was the main product of the project. They make that clear in the book. There were a number of people working on it. All I can do is confirm what their book says. I mean, it's accurate. I'm surprised at how accurate it is, because that database exists, and it's not really a database. It's a data warehouse, with a number of parallel stovepipes, because you can't describe what a pilot has seen the same way as a kid or a trucker or a radar. So you have to have a structure that cuts across and preserves the unique, stovepipe parameters of an aircraft or, another type of site. So that's what we built. I designed it. The credit should go to Lieutenant Colonel Kurth, who led the team that took it over from me. I transferred it to them after the design was done. What was done was only 1/3 of the work. If we had the plan was then to build another layer of authentication of the entire data warehouse, which were about 200,000 cases. Well, 200,000 records you can put in your cell phone today. So it's not a big database. What's big is that every record was very long and complex, okay? And that took time to dug up, validate, translate from other languages, and so on. We had translators, interpreters, and so on the staff, and they were trained to what to look for, what to recognize. And then, so it is pretty big at the end of the day. And then there was a third layer that I designed and never implemented of AI, on top of it. I mean, you need to use artificial intelligence. That's the proper use of AI to make sense of all that data.
Are you encouraged by the renewed interest in among Congress and the media, scientists? There's a lot of
I knew you were going to ask that, John. Yes, of course. Well, I'm encouraged by the fact that we've gone two steps ahead. We've removed all the stigma. I mean, they have astronomy at Harvard embracing UFOs now, okay? That's never happened before. You remember the days of Dr. Menzel? Dr. Menzel said, you're crazy to do this, I remember when these guys went on TV saying we shouldn't spend a penny on this stuff. Well, it's wonderful to see the scientific community waking up to that and saying, well, maybe there is something to that. At the time of the Condon report, I left the United States. I left behind an offer of a job heading up a department at Northwestern of AI. My PhD in 1967 was one of the first, I think it was the second PhD about AI applied to science, after one PhD at one project at Stanford called Dendro that had to do with chemistry. Mine had to do with astrophysics, and it worked. Okay, so this one, 1967. Well, it's appropriate to apply that technology to that. So we're making progress in that direction, finally. But we've also taken one step back. The step back that now, if it's real, it has to be classified. I don't believe that. I believe it is real. I believe there are some legitimate classified issues. There were a few classified cases in Blue Book, very few. When I asked Dr. Hynek about it, he laughed and he said, yeah, well, I can tell you what the UFO was. It was, a light that a lady saw, in the sky. I said, why does it have to be classified? We're sending this memo to the White House that this housewife has seen a light in the sky. I said, yeah, well, but she shouldn't have been there. And that particular place where she was when she saw it, the place was classified. There is a case that's classified, from a ship, from a Navy ship, a small ship that looks like a fishing ship. It wasn't a fishing ship, and their radar and they, with the naked eye, they saw a UFO. They reported it. Unfortunately, they were within 1.5 miles of North Korea. It was a spy ship. Oh. Well, you can't, if you put it, on TV, you are going to expose, the intelligence operation. The fact that they were not there looking for UFOs, they had to report it because it interfered with their instrument. So they're going to report it by the book. And by the way, they never stopped. That never stopped. When people say Blue Book stopped, yeah, but pilots continued seeing things. And they were reporting them because they could have been intruders. from Russia, from wherever. So those things never stopped. And so the public has all these false ideas about it. So that should not be, if we're serious about that, we should declassify most of that. And we should declassify, the data warehouse and all of that. I can't really talk beyond about that project, even though I architected it and, turned it over to Lieutenant Colonel, Kurth, who actually ran the project. So he should get the credit for that, and Colm oversaw all of that, Colm Keller. But I was there at the beginning as the architect, and I would have been re-engaging if the project had continued to build the AI, which I had designed already.
Jacques, the public has been hearing about ATIP, Lou Elizondo, all of his colleagues, Hal, for about 4 years now. And we know that effort had a very narrow focus: military encounters with UFOs, nuts and bolts craft. OSAP, as we're now learning from that book, had a much broader focus. It looked at UFOs, but it also looked at other weird phenomena that seemed to occur in the proximity of UFO events. Can the issues and the big questions about UFOs, UAP, visitors, other intelligences really ever be answered by only looking at the narrow view? Or do we need to have, as weird as it is, an honest look at all the other truly strange stuff that come along for the ride?
We need both, George. We need the new stuff. The reason it's so focused is that in the last 5 years, we've developed equipment which is unique at catching unknowns. I mean, it's catching them. We're not looking for unknowns. We're looking for, Russian jets or Chinese jets. So but in the last 5 years, there have been these infrared cameras under the wing of F-18s and other equipment and better radar. The radars on the Princeton were experimental radars. They were the very latest. So in the last 5 years, we've gotten data that the scientists can look at, that military, specialists can look at, and military contractors can work on that. So if it catches a UFO, then we're going to get a lot of data on UFOs. That's the hope. We're not quite there yet. Although I trust, I'll tell you who I trust. I trust the pilots with their eyes, Commander Fravor and the other pilots who actually saw the thing with their eyes. I trust that. Electronics, there are a lot of things about electronics that have not been talked about in that Nimitz case, about how fast the thing goes from one place to another. Well, there are a lot of things you can make happen to a signal that people may or may not be cleared to know about. I bumped into it just in my, work in venture capital, looking at advanced electronics. You see these patents, you see these articles about some aspects of that, and you say, somebody's got a technology, that could do those things. At some point, it's going to be a civilian technology. It will have, an application in civilian equipment. Until then, it's behind the fence somewhere. But there is a memo from Raytheon to the Navy, which is a multi-page memo. They don't say there are no UFOs, Raytheon makes the infrared camera. They said, we sold you that infrared camera, and yes, it works. And, we're proud of that. But be careful what you say about the images we give you, because you told us, you gave us a contract to deliver an infrared camera. Everybody talks about the images, about the pictures. Well, yeah, okay, that's a picture. It's really an infrared image of a temperature target. It doesn't tell you how far it was. It doesn't tell you how fast it goes. It doesn't tell you any of that. It's to distinguish, a bioreactor from a single reactor enemy aircraft. Okay, so you're looking at a temperature signature of a target. It's designed for war. It's designed for aerial combat. It's not designed to chase unknown things in the universe, okay? So they made it very clear. Yes, but be careful what we tell you. If you're talking about distance, you have to have another way of measuring the distance. So you have to match it to a radar, return somewhere. You can't just say this was 15 miles away, because we're not telling you that. Now, if it was a MiG, maybe you could say something about that. But if you suspect it's a UFO, you didn't give us if you gave us the characteristics of a UFO, we could design a very good camera to track them. But that's not what the contract said, okay? So it's a classic memo. It's a great engineering memo. Now, people have extrapolated in all directions about how fast they went and how they disappeared. Well, there are lots of ways to make a signal disappear from a device, including, a television set, including, this screen. So let's not go there. The larger picture is that we know from the experience with Blue Book that military cases are at best 10% of all the reports. Some farmer in his field sees something. The kids in San Antonio see something that falls, before them. That's not going to be reported to the Pentagon. I mean, why should they? Okay. If it's a bomber and they detect something like a B-52 detecting something, yes, the record will go to, the standard list, White House, NSA, CIA, Department of Defense, Coast Guard, whatever. I mean, whatever that's designed to do, it will go there. And nobody decides where it goes. You push a button, it goes to all of those. And that's a military system. That's only 10% of the database. And the other 90% are people, civilians, reporting it to whoever, to a journalist, to their mother, to whatever, to the newspaper usually. And that may or may not come to our attention. And then there is the rest of the world. I mean, the US, land mass of the US is 4% of the rest of the world. The other 97%, 96%, well, there's half of it is the Pacific Ocean. But, there are a lot of other countries. There is France, there is, the Russia, which is 8 times bigger than the US. What happens there? What happens in Japan? What happens in China? All of that we don't have. We have some data, but we don't have enough data. So if we're going to say something global about the phenomenon affecting mankind, we've got to look at everything. We can't just work from that exquisite little thing that the Pentagon has, from ASAP or whatever that project was called at any other time. So I think the BAS was the right way to do it, augmented by what we can get from the classified data.
Yeah, you have to be willing to look at experiences and reports in their totality, not just at what was the craft, how did it fly? Because as you have documented and written about for so many years, Passport to Magonia, that these creatures that we now call aliens may have been what previous generations called elves or fairies or gnomes, or this interaction that this other intelligence has had with us for all of our existence. It's not easily categorized, and you can't just solve it by studying flying saucers.
Well, I worked for a few years with a cultural anthropologist who was also a psychiatrist, a real psychiatrist, and a full university professor. And he said, I want to know, does this only happen in the US? I mean, these little creatures, and these stories, yeah, there are stories like that in, English folklore, the fairies and so on. But, how, so he went to the library and he came back and said, there is no book other than Passport to Magonia about the global thing about these creatures, but they are in every anthropology book as a footnote. Yeah. They say, by the way, you know, on the way to exploring this pyramid, the camel driver said that there were a story in his family of, 100 years ago, they saw, a little elf, or they saw a little creature. And those creatures are always described in the same way. They are pretty mischievous. They breathe our air, like the one in San Antonio. They are about 4 feet tall, and they can do all these magical things. Sometimes they are invisible. And you'd be surprised, I was, a few years ago, I was at a panel at a financial conference, in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, everybody's wearing these robes and so on. And President Clinton was there giving an address. The former Prime Minister of UK was there giving a speech and so on. And we had a panel on UFOs. The organizers thought that it would be interesting, since the world press was going to have another subject that would sort of open the minds of people. So Stanton Friedman was there. There were a number of scientists and so on. And so I had a friend in Saudi Arabia that I had met in Silicon Valley, was a young man, a graduate student, who had been at Stanford for a while. And he was the son of a prominent family in Riyadh. So he knew I was coming to be on that panel about UFOs with Stanton Friedman and so on. So he invited me to his house. And that was very interesting, because I met, I didn't meet any women there, but I met even his mother, but I met his father, his uncle, cousins of his, and so on. And they had a place in the desert. They are still thinking, even though Riyadh is a very, massive, modern city, they are still thinking of themselves as desert people. So they had a compound in the desert where we went to spend the afternoon and the evening. And they wanted to talk about UFOs. These were sophisticated people. They had degrees in physics, engineering. They had been pilots in the Saudi Air Force, which flies American jets. They knew how a radar works and so on. So we're eating mutton with our hands, sitting on a carpet, and they want to talk about UFOs. And we got into this thing about and I said, but in your tradition, you have these little people, the sylphs, I mean, in the Quran, God didn't just create men and angels, he also created men, angels, and sylphs, and jinns, the jinns, which we call sylphs or whatever in Europe. The jinns could do many of these magical things. They could appear and disappear. They could be short people, and they could do. And you have these ancient traditions. And my young friend said, "What ancient traditions? I mean, we still have them now." And I said, "Well, this is modern Saudi Arabia. I mean, you're building skyscrapers, and you have all these oil companies, and you have modern technology and jets. You're telling me you have jinns?" He said, "Well, a cousin of mine was in the kitchen in my house, and he needed a pot that was on the on the stove. So he took the pot and emptied the hot water outside, by the door, and then and what he didn't know was that there was a jinn there. He couldn't see the jinn. But when you do that, you're supposed to say, if dear jinn, if you're there, I'm going to pour some hot water, so I don't want to hurt you." And the jinn will disappear for good. Well, the young man was taken over by the jinn, and he suddenly became crazy. Couldn't, talk in a strange way, couldn't function, and they didn't know what to do. Psychiatrists would be of no help. They called an imam. They have special imams who are trained, just like in the Catholic Church, people who can talk to a demon and exorcise a demon. Well, so this imam came, did some ritual, set the young man in front of him and addressed the jinn and said to the jinn, we're sorry this happened. He did not mean to do that to you. He didn't mean to pour the hot water out of the kitchen. And he would like to go back to a normal life as a human. Would you please free him? And the young guy came back to normal. Now, this is today in a modern country, talking to people who fly jets and, do engineering and go to conferences with Bill Clinton, okay? This is not, strange folklore from way back. This, the story I'm telling you is just 10 years ago in a modern country. So come on, this has been with us for a long time. Is it the same thing? That's a real question. Is it the same thing, or is it just a new evolution of the same thing? Are there other creatures that can go in and out of our reality? Well, religion says that. Every religion says that. So the problem is, again, we can't take it to the lab.
Yeah.
But now maybe we can, thanks to Paola, thanks to Mr. Padilla, and thanks to that, we're going to get that, that object to talk. We've got the lab to do it.
Jacques Vallée, it's always great to talk to you. The book with Paula Harris is Trinity, The Best Kept Secret. It's a terrific book, and it's a page turner. It's an adventure story. And as always, with your work, you are meticulous in documenting each step of the way, how you respond to certain questions. I love it. I love it.